This is Transparency, a podcast by Gender Dysphoria Alliance, hosted by Kimberly and Terrell. Each week we'll be joined by people who have personal or professional experience with gender dysphoria and physical transition. We'll also discuss how our trans experiences relate to the concept of gender identity. Join us for a compassionate yet heterodox approach to the question of trans.
Welcome back to Transparency, everyone. It's just myself today, Kimberly, and my co-host Terrell here today. How are you doing, Aaron?
Doing great. Doing very well. Yourself?
Good. I've been looking forward to this episode.
Yeah, we got a lot of really good questions to tackle.
We do. And, one thing I was thinking, just minutes before we logged in here was, we started doing this not with any presumption that we have all the answers, but through, one conversation at a time, we're deepening our understanding of these issues and what gender dysphoria is. And what struck me with these questions, it's so humbling that people have come alongside us on this journey to explore the issue and talk about it and think about it. And you see that reflected in these questions. They're really smart questions that people are thinking deeply about this. I mean, not to knock the questions that we did when we had a previous Q&A, but you can kind of see the evolution as everyone's come along with us, and we're on this evolution of understanding, and it feels like the people that have been tuning in are also coming along in their understanding.
Yeah. The depth has increased for sure.
Yeah,
it's great.
Really great questions. So let's dig into the questions.
Let's do it.
All right, so I'll read the first one. So the first one is multiple questions in one, but they're all related. I'll read the whole thing first, and then we can tackle it one sub question at a time. So it starts off saying, hi, I want to ask a question, or rather questions on AGP, to try to tease out your thoughts on the divide between those who on one hand say AGP is the main driver for the male to female transition, and those who deny that it even exists. Is there any middle ground in the thinking on this topic? And he said, I heard a statistic quoted on one of your former editions, something like 75% of trans women being AGP, and I was surprised it was so high and curious about the basis of that figure. And could you comment about the basis on which people who say the concept of AGP has been totally discredited rest that claim? And what are your thoughts on the theory that gender dysphoria is a sort of DSD of the brain, i.e. that a trans woman is born with a brain that more resembles that of a woman than a man?
Yeah, so a whole lot going on.
Yeah, lots of rich questions there.
So
the first one being, that divide between those who say that AGP is the main driver for the majority of trans male to female transition, and those that say that it's totally debunked.
Yeah, we obviously clearly see that divide. Kind of the clinicians obviously say, or the ones who acknowledge the reality of what are transition motivators, understand that it is the majority or the major driver, and then the activists who deny it exists entirely because it kind of it discredits the idea of innate gender identities and things like that. But I think that there is a middle ground in that, and what I've started to see a lot more of is the trans activist side, the innate gender identity tribe, basically saying, yes, AGP exists, but it's rare and it's only it's not a major motivator. Most trans women aren't AGP, and that's kind of what I'm seeing a lot of now. It's kind of like they're acknowledging that it does exist, but that it's and then they do call it a fetish. They continue to kind of villainize it while saying it's like this dark, dirty subculture, and don't pay them any mind. So I don't know if that counts as middle of the road, but that's kind of how I would answer that. Is people are starting to acknowledge that it's there, but won't acknowledge just how pervasive and how common it is. And then they said that looks like the second part of that question is just about the figures, and that 75%, I believe it was both Dr. Ray Blanchard and Dr. Michael Bailey who concluded 75%. I don't know the methodology by which they determined that. Do you recall?
I don't remember the methodology. No, I mean, it was based on the people they were seeing coming into the clinic, right? And that they were seeing, and that wasn't just observed by them. That had been observed by clinicians even long before Blanchard's typology. And there have been different ways of trying to understand that and conceptualize it. And some people had typologies that had more subgroups within it. So different people have observed that there are these different cohorts that present differently, and they present at different times in their lives. So the middle-aged heterosexual men that had been coming in, and the children who are both male and female were coming in. So these were very observable types of people. And so it wasn't necessarily based on everyone who has gender dysphoria, because not everyone with gender dysphoria was necessarily coming into the clinics.
Right. That's such an important point.
But they were studying and trying to understand what are these two very distinct observable types of people coming in. And at that time is when they said that, that was roughly 75% were those heterosexual middle-aged men that were coming into clinics wanting to transition.
Yeah, and from my observation, again, completely unscientific, entirely anecdotal, is that that figure should be way higher now, because homophobia is much decreased than it was in the 80s. So there's less of an incentive for the homosexual subtype to be transitioning, and transgenderism is so much more accepted now than it was then. So much more reason for a man who has AGP to take the transition route. So I just feel like 75% is an actually quite low estimate, not for that time that he was actually conducting that research, but the current climate, I feel like it's much higher now. Probably I would wager somewhere in the 90%. But again, that's my anecdotally motivated, culturally influenced take on that.
Then queer theory has really obscured this picture, because there have been a number of national surveys that have been done on the trans population and breaking it down into demographics. But because of queer theory, when we break it all down into all these different, 78 genders and all the, different neo-pronouns and different sexual orientations, where is pansexual? I mean, realistically, a pansexual and a bisexual, like what is the difference?
I think a pansexual is a bisexual who believes in gender identity. That's the only thing I can figure out.
Exactly. But so I've tried looking up, what is the sexual orientation of the trans population today, and it's really hard to pull that data out in terms of whether you're exclusively androphilic, gynophilic, or bisexual is really hard to pull out of that data. And it's hard to pull out the data because are they saying they're gay based on their gender identity, or are they saying they're gay based on their biological sex? And so it's really obscured the data set. But it would still seem to be roughly 70% of trans women were gynophilic, meaning attracted to women, or bisexual, and that there were actually very few exclusively androphilic men transitioning in that data set that I saw. And that was a fairly recent survey from, I think it was can't remember if that was an American or a Canadian survey, but it was thousands of trans people were surveyed. And so it still seems to be the case that most trans women are either attracted to women exclusively or are bisexual. What I was going to say is, you're right that I think a lot of trans people do say, AGP is either completely debunked or yes, it exists, but it's a very small percentage. But I get the feeling that I think for a lot of trans women, the only times that they ever really hear about AGP is when it's being used against them as a slur.
Yep.
And I think it's such a disservice to those that really want to understand this, because our understanding, both from those who are using it as a slur and those who are receiving it as a slur, their understanding of AGP is really shallow either way. And the more, like, as my own understanding of it has deepened and evolved, I've developed a lot more empathy for those with AGP. The more that I really understand it and humanize it and talk to people that have experienced it, that to just call it a disgusting fetish is it's such a shallow and skewed read of what AGP is, I think.
Yeah, yeah, and like you said, that read of it is causing people, young men or older men or teenage boys who have this to obviously they don't see that in themselves, right? Because they don't because the vilified picture that is painted when people talk about AGP is like obviously that's not who they are and that's not how they experience their desire to be women. So they're not, it's not going to resonate with them. They're not going to understand this is what I have until they actually read, the text in the more nuanced and um, um, compassionate understandings of what their experience is, and that's when it clicks. Um,
Mhm. And
but
there are
yeah,
there are nuances, just like there are nuances within the homosexual subtype. I mean, some homosexuals that have gender dysphoria experience body dysmorphia, but not all do,
mhm,
right? So it seems to manifest differently from person to person, and AGP is sometimes anatomical, sometimes it's more clothing based, and that's all on a spectrum of experiences, from more of just the straight on sort of transvestic fetishism, which is more about clothing, is on a continuum to having that experience about your actual biological anatomy, and that's a piece I think a lot of people are missing, that AGP is not always anatomical, but it's
yeah,
those that have anatomical, and AGP isn't the same as gender dysphoria, that just like homosexual gender nonconformity isn't the same thing as gender nonconformity, but they're pathways to the development of gender dysphoria.
exactly.
So, and it's only tends to be those that experience anatomical AGP who are most highly motivated to transition. If someone can have their needs met just from occasionally cross-dressing, why would they take the risks or the expense of medically transitioning if they didn't have any anatomical AGP?
Well, I think there is a motivator there now because I think what we previously understood AGP to be, or what we call like transvestic fetishism, where it's all about the clothing and the makeup and the appearance and kind of like the uh, kind of like what we superficially think of as femininity. And so those that AGP is directed in that way, they still do have a motivation to transition in the sense that we understand transition today, which is kind of like living. Not obviously, they're not going to pass very well, but no desire to have a orchiectomies, things like that. It's like they can still transition in a way that's um, as we would say now, like living as a woman or living as a trans woman, because there is a social incentive to that now where there wasn't at all in the past. Um, Especially in kind of really progressive climates, it's like you kind of go from maybe being a reclusive weird dude to being um, uh, yeah, a
Mhm.
celebrated lesbian. So there is that incentive now. I would say that's a bit different than in the past.
It's like the threshold has been lowered in over
Right,
the
right.
years, and I would say that's true of the homosexual subtype too. I know you were saying because there's less homophobia, fewer gay and lesbians are transitioning, but I'd say when I looked at the stats of just the people that I saw and followed in my practice, the majority were same-sex attracted girls, and the so I think a lot of lesbians are still transitioning. Um, but most of the natal boys that I saw were were straight or bisexual, but the majority of girls that I saw were lesbians.
Okay, okay.
But I mean, the other thing too, though, if you know, going to looking at those, I think it's now 12 desistant studies that showed that most childhood gender dysphoria does resolve by through adolescence, and most of those kids that grow up to be gay, because that's not the public narrative. I think when we're looking at kids with gender dysphoria, those kids are automatically being labeled as trans and,
Right.
and being socially and then medically transitioned at a much earlier age. So I do think more homosexuals are probably being transitioned because people don't understand that experience is common amongst gay
Yeah.
people.
Yeah. That's a yeah, very good point. It's like what we're talking. Yeah. The young children. Absolutely. That's happening.
Yeah.
All
So
right.
yeah, so I think most of the resistance to this idea of AGP is largely based on a misunderstanding of what AGP is.
Yeah.
And I've also, one of the other subtleties or nuances that I've noticed from talking to people with AGP is it's not always overtly sexual. And if we think of it, I know we've gotten into trouble in the past by comparing it to a sexual orientation, but I think that's a really helpful concept because sexual orientation is multi-dimensional. It's not just sexual or being, that act of sex or being aroused. And people have described AGP, if you think of any heterosexual male, some are more highly sexual than others, even though their sexual orientation is all the same, and they're all heterosexuals, but some are very sexually motivated, some are more romantic, some have emotional bonds with their partners, and it's less of a sexual thing. So there's a range of ways to be a heterosexual male. And I think the same is true with AGP, is that the attraction to the self as female isn't always overtly sexual. Some develop an emotional bond to that idea.
Yeah.
Which is why
Yeah.
I think
It's a big.
just calling it a fetish really reduces it down
Yep.
to a very one-dimensional understanding of it.
Yeah. Yeah. I completely agree. Yeah.
So, in terms of middle ground, I don't know. I think maybe if we could call it a middle ground, I mean, it's not so necessarily middle between two poles, but I think better education and understanding of it, I think, will be helpful for us to try to start to get to a middle ground. I know there was a one, I can't remember who it was that said it, but she said that she actually admits to the sexual component of male to female transition, but she said that the sexual part of it is a trauma response. But I don't know why that would only be applicable to the heterosexual males transitioning and not the gay men transitioning, or not the females that are transitioning to male. But it doesn't really explain that, because it isn't our experience.
Yeah. Yeah. And you don't hear a lot of the autogynephilic experiences. They talked about it basically kind of manifesting out of nowhere. Like I don't think that there is. I mean, that I'm certain that was her experience, and maybe that's how yeah, we kind of make sense of ourselves in all sorts of ways. But I think that's yeah, it's definitely not. I don't think that's a common origin of
Yeah.
AGP personally.
And I think we get into trouble when we base all of our understanding of these things on personal narratives, because we're all
Yep. Yep.
we all have internalized a slightly different narrative to try to make sense of this experience, and that doesn't make it true. Like, we all come up with a narrative that feels good for us.
It's exactly why I'm so excited about what we're doing here and all the people that we're interviewing, and just like you just tell your own story, and it's not like we're like ever going to be like, oh, you're, of course not, but I mean, it's like what we get from having so many different people tell their very different stories is you realize that just how multifaceted it is. And yeah, what we call gender dysphoria is a myriad of different experiences. But yeah, all we can do as far as learning people's experiences is their personal narrative, and a lot of that is what they've told themselves and what they want to believe of their experience.
Or what the community has told them.
Yes, yeah,
So
absolutely.
the basis for those who say that AGP has been totally discredited comes from a couple of papers. There's one paper where they had an AGP scale that they asked natal females similar questions about sexuality, and determined that the conclusion of this study was that, well, AGP must not exist because this is just a normal female experience, and that actually reaffirms my femaleness, that cis women, I'm in air quotes, cis women experience that as well, that they feel sexy being in their bodies. So this is erotic embodiment is the new terminology, right? Erotic embodiment rather than AGP. But again, that seems very specific to only one cohort of trans people that experience this erotic embodiment. I know I haven't.
No, nor I. Yeah. There's two different debunkings as they would put it. Is yes, it's like AGP exists, but women have it, so me as a trans woman having this experience, it's totally normal because women have this experience. And then the other is no, it's just it's just bullshit. There is no such thing. It's just a transphobe trying to paint all trans women or yeah as perverts, which obviously if you read Ray Blanchard, who coined the term, he's absolutely not doing that. But still, I think most people who object, I think most serious people in the trans debate on the gender identity side, they really try to avoid it entirely and don't actually directly engage with the concept. Whereas it's mostly the kind of activists, online activists, who really aren't educated in it. They just have heard that it's a transphobic lie, and so that's just what they say it is. And so much of AGP is debunked is people who have no idea, really. They don't really understand what AGP is. They don't understand what the typology is, and they don't understand what debunking it would even look like, because it hasn't been debunked. But like so it doesn't seem to be coming from a very educated place. And when you ask, when I start asking for people like, okay, so you're saying it's out of date, it's been debunked, it's irrelevant now. This was obviously highly rigorous and intensive research that was done and studied and peer reviewed and accepted. And obviously, like as you're saying, for the eons before that we've seen transgender people, it's kind of been a given that these two motivations exist. Um, uh, and then so when you say, okay, so obviously some new science must have come along to say that this isn't real, or that there's a better explanation for why heterosexual or bisexual males transition. And they just start talking about how there is, and we're going to get to this in one of the questions later on, is that there is there's something in the brain that makes somebody transgender, and what they're referencing is a study that was conducted entirely on same-sex attracted transitioners. And so they just stop. They don't. It just turns into accusations and whatnot at that point. There's nothing that's ever been done, obviously, to discredit it. And so the debunking is just a very shallow argument.
Part of the problem too is that we all have access to a little bit of information. So we all have access to a lot of these studies, at least the abstract of the studies. But we don't necessarily have the training to analyze the studies and really critically think about, what is the study design? Are they really drawing conclusions that fit the data? Is their methodology sound? And what is the context of this study, in context of all the studies that exist? But also a lot of the headline, the titles of studies and the abstracts can be a bit misleading. And so anyone who really wants to dig into evidence, people that like the Cochrane reviews, when you're really digging into systematic reviews of evidence, you need a certain amount of training and knowledge to be able to do it. I'm not qualified to do that. It requires a certain amount of clinical understanding of research to really dissect those studies. And you can't base anything on a single study. You have to look at the entire body of studies over time. And you're right, there really hasn't been any scientific study that has completely displaced Blanchard's research,
or pointed to any other, realistic motivation for that phenomenon.
And did you hear? Did you see that paper? Because Bailey did a follow-up paper to basically counteract that study I just mentioned about surveying women and to see if they feel attracted to their own bodies, but they did do a follow-up study to that and debunked the debunking.
Who would have thought that would be the result? Okay.
And then, so the last part of that question is, what are your thoughts on the theory that gender dysphoria is a sort of DSD of the brain? You touched on this a little bit already. That a trans woman is born with a brain that more resembles that of a woman than a man. So let's flesh that out a little bit more.
Yeah, we kind of touched on that a bit. There have been studies into, but it was exclusively same-sex attracted, both male and female transitioners. And that's the kicker there is basically, I think what was determined was what we're really seeing there is a homosexual brain, not a transsexual brain. And so it doesn't really apply to the to the heterosexual transitioners. It's a completely different phenomenon going on there.
Yeah, if I understand the science of this correctly, I think what they've landed on at this point is that there's really no such thing as a male brain or female brain, that they can't really reliably see the differences between male brains and female brains, but they can see the difference, generally speaking, between androphilic brains and gynophilic brains.
Wait, so, but I thought the way that was done was that, like, so you've got this base group of this is the average female brain, or this is the design, because there are like certain parts of the brain that are smaller or larger depending on the sex. It's not like, it's similar to like, skeletons and heights and stuff. It's not like you can't really sex somebody based on looking at their brain. But as I understand it, there is, generally a typical female brain and a typical male brain, and that's how they were determining the androphilic versus gynophilic. Or is that what you're saying? Is like
that's
either...
what I'm saying. That
okay.
I mean, it just so happens that most women are androphilic, most women are heterosexual, most men are heterosexual. So most of the differences that they're seeing between male and female brains could actually be their sexual orientation, because when they scan the brains of homosexual men, their brains do resemble more like women's brains. But it doesn't mean they have women's brains. It means that there are similarities. They have androphilic brains. Yeah, I think it's organized more around their sexual orientation than the sex of the individual.
Yeah, and that is interesting, because we certainly know that androphilic men and androphilic women certainly have different relationships to sex. So by just the frequency and the diversity of seeking it out. So when it comes to sex, androphilic men are very much typically male in that regard. So so yeah, that is interesting when we come to analyzing the brains there. I wonder what the difference is in that determinant.
James Cantor wrote a paper summarizing some of the brain scan studies, and he said, I think even the title of the paper was something like, recent MRI studies confirm Blanchard's typology, because when they, you're right that a lot of the fault of a lot of the studies is they don't control for sexual orientation. If you think that a trans person is just a trans person, and you line up 500 trans people and scan their brains and don't control for sexual orientation, it's really not going to be very meaningful data. But when they do control for sexual orientation, they find that the homosexual transsexuals' brains do look more similar to the opposite sex, but that's not the case for the AGP type of male to female transsexuals.
Yep.
So he said there's a line in his study that says, if there's a case, and he didn't say there was a case, but if there was a case for transsexualism being a kind of like a DSD of the brain, that would only apply to the homosexuals.
Yep. Well, we gave that wasn't an involved question.
that was a cluster of fantastic questions. Yeah. So you want to ask the next one?
Yeah. So next up is another great one. I have an FTM sibling who my kids only know as an uncle. I teach my kids about biological sex in an age-appropriate way, but haven't broached this topic because my sibling passes very well. When I do explain gender dysphoria / transition to them, how would you suggest I describe it?
It's a tough question. And the person asking the question didn't say how old the kids were, so it's hard to say what is age appropriate in this specific case. But I'd say less is more information. Like I don't think kids. This is different because it's somebody that they know.
Yeah.
But I don't think kids need a lot of detailed information about, homosexual gender dysphoria or AGP. I mean, I think these are difficult concepts, I think, even for a lot of adults to really wrap their heads around. So I don't think kids would really understand that. And I don't think it's really necessary for them to know. So maybe something just very short and sweet, you know, that there's a handful of conditions that make people want to be the opposite sex.
Yeah. Yeah.
I mean, does it have to be more complicated than that? You know, there's a handful of conditions, you know, that are quite rare, and you know that the doctors can diagnose, and there are certain cases when the doctors feel it's appropriate for people to medically, you know, change their bodies to appear like the opposite sex, and
Yeah.
and for some certain conditions that's helpful, and I
Yeah.
don't think it has to be any more complicated than that.
No, I think you're absolutely right. Yeah, and I think it might. I'm wondering how useful it would be to. Well, I think it would be entirely helpful for her to discuss it with her sibling as well. It's like, look, I'm going to be honest about biology with my children, and what what's your opinion, or what would you? I mean, obviously, it's your children. You explain it to them as is correct. But yeah, since this is somebody that's obviously deeply involved in their lives, that yeah, consulting them on how they would like to that subject to be broached. But yeah, otherwise I completely agree. It's like, Uncle so and so was born a girl, but had one of these unusual conditions that made him very uncomfortable with his body, and now he medically changed it to look like a man. And I think that's just kind of the way to phrase it, which is
Mhm.
just the exactly honest
Yeah.
reality of it.
I could see a potential conflict there if the uncle in the story has a more of a queer theory ideological way of understanding their own
Yeah,
transition, and the parent in this story doesn't really believe in that ideology. I could see there being a conflict there,
absolutely. Yeah, very good
which
point.
which
That's
be
touchy.
that difficult to navigate within a
Hmm.
family. Yeah.
Yep. All right. Next up.
How do you guys work through the paradox of gender not mattering and knowing that, but still deciding to transition and care about it? How about others in the community?
I it is I think it does appear as a paradox. I can entirely understand that, phrasing it that way. To me, it doesn't feel like a paradox because, well, first of all, I don't believe that gender doesn't matter. I do think for a lot of reasons in society, gender, it exists for. And when I say gender, I mean the kind of social manifestation of sex is what I mean by gender. And I think for a lot of reasons, gender has always and will always be a part of human civilization because yeah, because we're sexually dimorphic and that yeah. Anyway, um, but I don't believe that I have a gender identity. I know that I have gender dysphoria, and I know that it's greatly reduced by my physical transition and by society perceiving me as if I were male. And yes, for the rest of the community, I don't know how to answer for them, but I don't know. How would you answer that one?
Yeah, I think my answer is similar. You know, I've been thinking pretty deeply about this stuff for a long time, and I think I've worked out what my own reasons for, my dysphoria and my transition were about, but that knowledge doesn't cure the gender dysphoria.
Right, right.
I still have it. And,
Hmm.
had I been born at a different time or a different place, maybe I wouldn't have developed gender dysphoria. I mean, I keep coming back to one of Vasey's studies where he looked at Samoans who, a lot of the effeminate gay men are identified as fa'afafine, and are just, even into adulthood, are very feminine presenting gay males, and they know that they're gay males. They know they're not actually women. And so the conclusion he drew from this paper, that in societies that tolerate and create space for the gender nonconformity of homosexuality, that they don't tend to develop gender dysphoria.
Hmm.
And I think that's a mistake that has been made in the past in treating gender dysphoria, is they've attached the gender nonconformity to the dysphoria, and they've tried to get rid of all of that, right? They tried to get rid of the gender nonconformity, taking dolls away from boys, and or not letting boys wear dresses. So they've packaged the gender dysphoria and the gender nonconformity up into one thing and tried to get rid of all of it. But I think what Vasey's studies are pointing to is that the gender nonconformity is just an organic aspect and a dimension of homosexuality that is expressed more in some cultures than others. And I think in the West, that aspect of homosexuality has been really repressed.
Mm-hmm.
And I think gender dysphoria is a culture-bound condition in places where that is repressed and not allowed to give expression, and so that it turns into distress and discomfort, that doesn't resolve as we get older. So do I think it should be that way? No, but it I would love to see a world where we can just be ourselves and express ourselves and not have to repress aspects of ourselves in ways that end up creating psychological conditions.
Mm-hmm.
That would be awesome, but that isn't the world that I was born into. So I did develop gender dysphoria, and it even today hasn't fully resolved, despite how much work I've done to understand it and really dig through my own stuff. I don't think in my case it was as simple as just trauma. I think I was probably born, a type of gay person that had, this very intense gender nonconformity, and had I been born in a different place in a different time, maybe that wouldn't have progressed into gender dysphoria, or maybe the dysphoria would have resolved as it does in 80% of the cases.
I've been thinking a lot about that too. Is when I was very young, what I remember the constant messaging is girls don't do that, girls don't do that, girls don't wear this, and just constantly, it was like a constant state of shame is what it felt like, that I was always doing, that I was always getting it wrong in my behavior. And when with all the things that were boy related is what I wanted to be doing and what felt, fun and natural, but I knew that was wrong. And I think what my brain did was that just decided that it was my body that was wrong, like that. And so that external messaging is internalized. And I think that's exactly that was all brought up for me reading that Vasey's conclusions about.
Mm-hmm.
It's like, yeah, would it never have been a problem with my body had I just been allowed to be as I was naturally, as was natural. So I think it's probably spot on.
Mm-hmm. All right, should we move on to the next question?
Yeah. All right. Here we go. Do you think gender variant behaviors, homosexuality, dysphoria, GNC, etc., have a biological basis?
I think with homosexuality, I think it's more straightforward in homosexual males than it is homosexual females. Blanchard's done, one of Blanchard's major contributions to science is actually his studies on the causes of homosexuality. And he discovered that that one of the causes of male homosexuality is having a lot of older brothers. And that he discovered that as when a woman has multiple males, I hope I don't misrepresent this, I hope I understand the science correctly, but it's her immune system starts to, her immune system ends up having an impact on the testosterone levels that the fetus is exposed to. And that because of the hypotestosterone exposure of the male fetuses, that they end up becoming homosexuals. Now, I think it was Bailey that told me that there's really only one cause of male homosexuality, and that is the hypotestosterone exposure. But there's multiple reasons for why that the testosterone levels were low. So there's different reasons for why the testosterone's low, but there's really only one cause of male homosexuality. I don't think that's true for women.
No, I don't think so either.
I do think there are studies that say that one cause of female homosexuality is testosterone exposure. So the kind of the opposite of male homosexuality. So I do think there's a type of female homosexuality that could be an analogy to male homosexuality, but I don't think all lesbians, I don't think that's the case for all lesbians.
Yeah,
And
I
we,
agree with you.
yes, and we know that the female sexuality in general tends to be more fluid and more relational than that target.
Hmm.
You know, I think that's why we don't really see a lot of AGP in women, is that female sexuality isn't target based. We don't have this, you know, psychological target, and so we can't experience target location errors.
Hmm.
But I think butch lesbians in particular are, I'm going to hazard a guess that a lot of butch lesbians are the type of lesbian that were um, related to high testosterone.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
my hunch, and probably why it's butch lesbians that experience gender dysphoria more so than other types of more like feminine presenting lesbians.
Hmm. Hmm. Yeah, and then there's also the DSD element as well, which is entirely biological, right? And that's a major cause of dysphoria. I think mostly in natal females. I can't remember. Alice Drager wrote about it. I can't remember the specific what it was, but you don't really see. I'm not like the DSD types of dysphoria. Do those exist in the male population, to your knowledge?
That's a good question. The ones that I've known have all been natal females,
Yeah.
and you know, so it's a small percentage of people with DSDs, and it tends to be the female DSDs that I'm aware of, the ones that are related to testosterone. So
Hmm.
the one that I had, for example, the ovotesticular one, because I had testicular tissue, my testosterone levels would have been high even as a fetus until that was
Hmm.
removed. And there are other, like the congenital adrenal hyperplasia also is associated with high testosterone,
That's yeah. Yep.
and they're more likely to be lesbians. They're more likely to choose male occupations, and I'm guessing are more likely to
To develop the
experience
yeah.
gender dysphoria as well.
Would assume yeah.
Which then, you know, raises the question for me, is if it's testosterone exposure in the DSDs that have higher rates of gender dysphoria. Because I think with the ovotesticular DSD, it's a very high rate of gender dysphoria, to almost like a 50-50 mix of, we don't know
Wow.
what this person's going to, you know, what sex they're going to identify with as they get older. So that it's a very rare DSD, but it's one where they struggle to assign a sex at birth because of the high unpredictability of what that person's self-identity is going to be.
Right. Right.
Um, but if it's the testosterone exposure that a female is exposed to in utero that causes DSD related gender dysphoria, but it's also testosterone um, that causes some types of homosexuality, it kind of makes me wonder, is DSD related gender dysphoria really much different from gay gender dysphoria if they're both related to testosterone, to either testosterone exposure or too little testosterone exposure? They could be
Yeah.
the same thing
It
at the
could. It
brain
very
level.
yeah. Yeah. It very well could. Yeah. That's interesting. Yeah.
And
But
either way, it doesn't make your brain more like the opposite sex. Like I think, like in my pathway, I was both same sex attracted and had a DSD. You know, I think it's like the DSD being exposed to too much testosterone
that probably
probably
preceded the homosexuality.
probably is what
Yeah.
made me a homosexual. And then, so I don't know, I mean, is my GD DSD related or the homosexual subtype? Like, I'm not sure it
Yeah.
matters because it's the same
It's
pathway.
probably just too high testosterone related.
Yeah,
The others are just contributing factors or resulting factors.
yeah.
Uh, yeah, I know. I I never had. Well, when I went in to get my initially start testosterone, I was told that I had. I don't know, remember the numbers, but that I had very high testosterone for a female as it was, and I also had very late and very painful or late starting menstruation, very painful, very irregular, and I think those two are probably somehow related.
There's studies to that effect too, that they do. There is a correlation between hormone imbalances and gynecological problems, like polycystic ovarian syndrome. And even anecdotally, just knowing a lot of trans guys over the years, seems like the majority of them had some kind of gynecological problem.
Yeah, yeah, I've heard a lot of that too. So I guess the answer to the question is yes. There is a biological basis.
Yeah, perhaps indirectly, but with AGP, I don't know that we know for sure that there's a biological basis. But I mean, it sounds like Blanchard and Bailey feel like it's could be something you're born with.
Yeah. So, and I talked to Bailey about this directly. I don't, the concept of being born with autogynephilia, that doesn't make sense to me. But autogynephilia being a target location error and being born with a propensity for a target location error, that's what makes sense to me. It's like if there's something in the brain that's not to be offensive, but not wired correctly, and that you're more easily it's more easy to get those wires crossed, and that would result in autogynephilia. That's my take. He definitely said it was reasonable, but obviously I don't have any science to back that up.
I think that makes a lot of sense, and I think that I would also explain why, if you have one target location error, you tend to have multiple, or yep. more likely to have multiple. So you're more likely to have AGP as well as, I don't
being
know,
a furry
or a foot fetish or whatever, right? So that makes sense, right? If the vulnerability is to the location error, not a specific target, makes sense to me. And we do hear people with AGP, because Debbie has written about it. She recalls childhood experiences of AGP. And initially that confused me, because if they have childhood experiences of AGP, then why is that called late onset gender dysphoria, whereas the childhood experiences of the homosexual subtype are called early onset? But I think that's because we need to separate the idea of AGP and the homosexual gender nonconformity from our concept of gender dysphoria, and that homosexual gender nonconformity can almost immediately lead to gender dysphoria in early childhood. I know that mine developed almost as soon as I understood the difference between boys and girls and developed a categorization system of male and female. I almost immediately placed myself in the boy category, and almost immediately that caused me distress, because that was confusing. So I think that's why gender nonconformity in gay and lesbians can almost immediately turn into gender dysphoria in early childhood, whereas AGP doesn't tend to cause gender dysphoria immediately. So they might have childhood experiences of AGP, but it's not gender dysphoria yet.
Yeah, what they seem to report is basically just having a fixation on all things about girls, like they're wanting to wear their clothes, and it's completely asexual, obviously, because they're prepubescent. But to me, it's quite analogous to just how young children will have like crushes on one another that are completely platonic or chaste or whatever and then it's only after puberty that there becomes a sexual element. And so I think for a lot of people who are autogynephilic, it could have been quite minimal in so much as to not even realize, like not have any memories of childhood of being like fixated on, wishing you could wear the skirt, like it could be that those experiences weren't very memorable or very long lasting, and that's why it just didn't exist in their brain until puberty. But I think then for those who it was more intense, or not more intense, but like they remember those feelings, again, those non-sexual feelings from childhood, and then they become sexual post-puberty. But yeah, I think with AGP, there's no external clue, as if for a child, whereas with the homosexual, it's evident to the people around this child that they're gender non-conforming. But with the AGPs, it's an entirely internal experience, and it's only when you can't hide it anymore and you get caught, when it becomes a sexual thing.
Whereas so everyone observed that I was gender nonconforming as a little kid,
right. But yeah, having a fixation on high heels, it's nobody's gonna know that, because don't tell anybody it.
Exactly. So I've come to understand gender dysphoria as just meaning the compulsion to change sex.
Oh,
right?
oh,
But that there are multiple pathways to that,
sure.
and that little boys with AGP don't necessarily feel a compulsion to change sex at that age,
I see. I see what you mean.
whereas a little kid who's extremely gender nonconforming, like I was, who made this sort of categorization error
Right.
in their head that I was, who was distressed from that as I was, I had a drive to be the opposite sex right from age 3.
Yep. Okay. Yep. Yep. Okay, that's an interesting way of phrasing it. But a lot of AGPs don't have the desire to change sex, or at least not for more than once or twice a day. Like
Yeah,
it's not. Yeah,
well, just like
it's not.
not all gender nonconforming homosexuals want to change sex. I think
True.
not
Yep.
all people with AGP develop gender dysphoria,
Yeah.
and
Yep.
even if they did, not all of them are then actually acting on it and medicalizing.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. Yeah, gender dysphoria is basically just the desire to change sex.
That's how I've started to think of it. Anyway,
Okay.
if it stops being useful, I'll drop that.
We'll change it. Yeah.
But
Yeah.
um,
Whose turn is it?
I think it's my turn to read.
Okay.
So why do you consider yourselves, in terms of your birth sex, if you aren't perceived that way by the vast majority of the outer world and have taken surgical procedures to hide it?
Because I morally can't not do that anymore. That's my answer to this question. Is I didn't obviously intend to be this out about the reality of my sex, but it's useful to be. I feel like I do it because it can, yeah, because there's just so much darkness being hidden under all the obfuscation of gender lingo, and I just I kind of overcame that revulsion, or that aversion to saying that I am female, and I say it because it's true, and I think it's helpful to clear through all the BS, smoke and mirrors. um, but yeah, that's why I do it. It's not something I certainly wanted to do, but yeah,
Yeah.
here we are.
And we're on Twitter talking about this stuff and YouTube talking about this stuff. I mean, I don't, and that's the context in which people are getting to know us. Like
That's true.
I don't announce everywhere I go, like when I
Yep.
go to the grocery store to buy my groceries or fill up my fill up my car with gas. I'm not announcing to everyone, oh, by the way, I'm biologically female.
Right.
Um,
Right. Yep. I'm
but
still legally male, and I
yeah,
still exist in the world as such.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. It's just for this.
But I think it's important to, when it comes to developing public policy and law, I mean, that's where I think it's important to retain our understanding of biological sex, because I'm not, I wasn't born male, and I'll never be biologically male, and that matters. I am different.
Mhm.
It's like I'm a different kind of guy in the world. Um, and I just think it's really important to retain our awareness of that, and retain our
Yeah.
awareness of what we
Yeah.
understand about biological sex in terms of psychology, behavior, and our just our physical health. Like there's so many different reasons for why it's helpful for me to retain that information about myself and integrate that into my self concept. Because what I was really struggling with, and I hear this a lot in the community, is a struggle with, it's called imposter syndrome. That they feel like, yeah, I'm a man and I exist in the world as a man and I'm legally male and I look male, but I can't get rid of this imposter syndrome. I just have this insecurity all the time. And I think that's a pretty common
Yeah.
experience. And that just kind of goes away when it's like, you know what, I'm a trans dude, I'm not a dude.
Yeah.
And integrating all of that into my self-concept has really helped to improve just my self-esteem, and just to be able to just kind of drop feeling like, well, why do I have to be a dude like every other dude? I mean,
Right.
it sucks. I wish I didn't have this condition, but this is my reality. And why is that not okay? Like, why is it not okay to just be trans and embrace our full reality?
Yep, yep. It's psychologically much more beneficial. Yeah, to us to embrace the reality of it. And, when you said imposter syndrome, it's like it's not a syndrome, is it? You know, I am an imposter. So,
Because we can never, and that's why it's different from imposter syndrome. You know, like if I went and did a degree in something and then started the career, and I mean that's usually where we hear about imposter syndrome. If it's my self-esteem,
right,
I'm qualified, I did the
right,
degree,
right,
I just don't have the confidence in myself. Whereas this is
right,
quite different. It's not just a confidence issue, it's that I can't convince myself
right.
that I truly am male. And I don't feel confident that everyone else around me, if they knew this about me, would really believe that either. How do you
Hmm.
ever feel secure? Because that is a reality, right?
Yeah,
That I'm not biologically male, so of course I'm not, like, I don't want to induce psychosis in myself to try to
yeah,
believe that that's true.
yeah, yeah. To feel like you're always walking on unstable ground, essentially, is what that feels like.
Yeah. So it feels so much better to just kind of drop that. I mean, Miyoko talked
Yep.
about that a little bit too, and when we interviewed her, when she talked about discovering and finally accepting the concept of homosexual transsexualism. You know, initially she felt kind of offended by that, but once she really understood it and realized that is what I am, something just lifts off of you, right? It's
Right.
so freeing. It's like, this is what I am, and my
Hmm.
reality is actually okay. That I actually,
Yeah.
when I really understand what my reality is, it's not such a bad thing, and so I don't need to carry around this burden of trying to be something else.
Yep. 100%. All right. Is my turn? I'm not keeping track
Your
of this
turn.
very well. Okay. Do you think gender dysphoria is a form of body dysmorphia or something else? Should both be separate diagnoses?
Yes, I think they should be separate. I think some gender dysphoria seems to progress into body dysmorphia, but not always. So I think body dysmorphia, in the case of gender dysphoria, it seems to be a symptom of gender dysphoria for some people, but it doesn't, not everyone with gender dysphoria seems to experience the same types of body dysmorphia.
Yeah. Speaking of definitions of gender dysphoria, to me, I always defined, and I wasn't aware that other people didn't define gender dysphoria this way, was that back when I was a believer in trans and that I had a male brain and all that nonsense, which actually based on a previous conversation, maybe I do a bit, but no, that's a different topic. But with I always define gender dysphoria as body dysmorphia specific to your sex characteristics. That was always my definition
Mm.
of dysphoria, and my dysphoria was always very body based. And so, um, so yeah, for me, it's like I see them as the same thing, but dysphoria is just specific to your sex characteristics. That was my understanding. So
Yeah, mine didn't really, I don't remember my gender dysphoria starting out physical. Like if I think about what it was like, for me, it was almost pre-verbal. It was just, I think for me, it was more of a cognitive process of, um, you know, I've described it as like an error in cognitive categorization. I
mhm.
just had so many traits that everyone was saying, this is what boys are, this is what girls are, and those differences were observable, probably specific to my culture and where I was living too. I mean, there wasn't a lot of diversity, so that was probably a factor. But when all girls look and behave a certain way, and all boys look and behave a certain way, and you're behaving in so many ways that are similar to the boys, in my naive sort of that subconscious process of cognitive categorization, I just felt, well, I just seemed to fit with the boys then, and not the girls. So my mind, I think, categorized me as male. And so any situation I was in as a kid where you either had to be divided by male or female and make that choice, right? Like if they were to say, okay, all the girls go over to that side of the field and all the boys over to that. So any of those situations where boys and girls were separated
Mhm.
in some way, where anytime I had to think about myself in terms of, am I a boy or am I a girl? So
Mhm.
shopping for clothes, shopping for toys, like any of those situations
Okay.
where in my mind, I had to choose, okay, am I a boy or a girl? That's where this really intense distress boiled up for me, because in I knew my mind was making a mistake. Like, I felt like,
Mhm.
no, I was supposed to be a boy, and this is the category I belong to. But I knew that technically wasn't true, because I did have enough awareness of my body. It's like, okay, like other people are telling me I'm a girl, and I know that, I knew enough about anatomy and stuff. It's like, okay, so I'm not. So that it was just so cognitively confusing for me. But as I got older, that became more and more and more about my body.
Right.
Before I developed any kind of breasts or anything, I would walk around shirtless just like any of the boys. I mean, I just wanted to wear
Me
swim
too.
trunks and
Yeah.
and go swimming. I mean, that for me, that was, I just wanted to do everything that the boys were doing. So when I entered into puberty and my body started changing, that's when it became more about dysmorphia. It's like as a kid, my mind had mapped my body to have a boy body, to have a flat chest, and
Mhm.
and and that's how my brain mapped myself. And so when I started to develop breasts, for me, because my brain hadn't mapped that as part of my body, it felt so alien to me. It just felt
Mhm.
like something, it felt like there were cancerous tumors stuck to my body.
Mhm.
That's really how I
Mhm.
experienced it.
Mhm.
And when some people, when they talk about getting surgery, they have like phantom sensations of their body parts aren't there anymore, and they have, so that's because their body had mapped their anatomy, and now that they've removed that anatomy, now they're experiencing phantom sensations. I never experienced that because
Okay.
my body had mapped a flat chest, so removing my breasts just created congruence between
Mhm.
what my brain was, how my brain had mapped my body, and what my body actually looks like now. And I could tell like exactly where everything was on my body, and close my eyes, like it just, so it solved that problem for me. And so I would say that part is body dysmorphia, that my brain had mapped a body that wasn't actually my bodily reality.
Yeah, so I had as a young person, I had a very different, not very different experience, but for me, it was all what was being told. Like I wasn't making an error in my brain. I wasn't. I don't think I was really thinking about um, boys and girls really. I think because I was homeschooled and only around family and close like church friends and whatnot. So there's less of a designation between the boys go here and the girls go there. We all kind of played together, but there was a designation on what were like girl typical activities and what were boy typical activities, which are kind of like normal, yeah. But for me, it was that I was constantly behaving in a way that was associated with the boys, and I was always playing with the boys in the boy games and wanting to dress like a boy, and I was constantly being told, no, don't do that, or girls don't do that. It wasn't that I wasn't allowed to do those things. I was just constantly reminded that it was inappropriate that I was doing those things.
Mm.
So it wasn't, so I never had I always understood that I was physically a girl. Like I never made that, like I never had that kind of internal distress. I just had a deep desire to be a boy, because then I could just be free to be doing what I wanted to be doing. But my
Mhm.
body was telling me that I should be doing and the people around were saying that my body meant I needed to be doing, these things that which felt, you know, just boring and uncomfortable and not, what I wanted. Anyway, so I think that, so I didn't have that kind of categorization issue. It was like I just knew what boys were and I knew what girls were, and I knew I wanted to be with the boys, but I knew it. So I definitely, by your definition of like desiring to be the opposite sex. Yes, I had that for my first understanding of what the difference between boys and girls were. But yes, but I entirely with you again is I didn't have that kind of body dysmorphia until breasts started developing and they were not supposed to be there.
Mhm.
And yeah, and then post surgery it was, yeah, just like just the relief. The relief is all, it's like still I'm just constantly relieved. It's
Mhm.
like this is what it was always supposed to be. And like I know that's kind of so weird for people who don't experience it to feel like, um but um but yeah, it's like this is what my body was supposed to look like. And so yeah, so yeah, I didn't have body dysmorphia as a child, but I think the body dysmorphia was a result of, well, maybe,
It's hard to say, right? It
yeah,
like, was the
yeah,
body just
chicken
is,
and egg.
yeah, it's chicken and egg. Like, so what, the dysmorphia, was that a result of the gender dysphoria, or does it only become gender dysphoria at the point that it becomes body dysmorphia? I don't really know. I don't know
Yeah.
exactly where to draw that distinction, but it does seem like a very sizable proportion of people with gender dysphoria do have a type of body dysmorphia, or at least it progresses into that at some point.
So I am curious, what is gender dysphoria with, again, because my definition has always included that body dysmorphia. So I am one like what does in adults, what does gender dysphoria look like if there isn't a component of body dysmorphia? What is that, just a social
Yeah, that's a
thing?
good question. Yeah, I'm not sure. So maybe body dysmorphia is always present with gender dysphoria. I mean, it doesn't sound like it's always present with all forms of AGP, especially the non-anatomical type of AGP. I don't know that would turn into a body dysmorphia.
Right, but would we even call that gender dysphoria though? Then,
No,
like if
probably
it's
not.
not, if it's just the kind of occasional fantasy kind of deal.
Mhm.
But I do know that there is like an experience of being uncomfortable being socially sexed as your sex and wishing that you were regarded as if you were the opposite sex, and it not, and maybe not having it reflect, and then you're not being worried about your own physical body, maybe not having any dysmorphia, but having just a strictly social dysphoria. I could see that being,
Mhm.
maybe that would be another kind. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't think we could ever just call it body dysmorphia though, because I think it has a different root cause and a different pathway than other types of body dysmorphia. There may be some
Yeah, I
similarities,
see. I
but
see. Yeah.
like people compare gender dysphoria to anorexia, for example, and there's a certain amount of body dysmorphia that could be involved with anorexia too, if they see themselves as much larger than they actually are.
Yeah.
So I
Yeah.
think that's why a lot of people make the parallel. But I think there's separate conditions though, like anorexia and gender dysphoria, even though they may share some symptoms in common. I think that at least in the classic gender dysphoria, I think those similarities break down pretty quickly when you really kind of dig into the root cause and pathways.
But both are appear to be strictly Western phenomenon.
Yeah. I think that parallel between anorexia and gender dysphoria is probably more true with the new cohort, like the
Yeah.
ROGD
Oh yeah.
cohort than the classic. Because I used to work for the Provincial Eating Disorders Program, and when I worked for the program a number of years ago, and I was there for I think about 4 years, I don't recall ever having a trans patient in that program. But I'm still in touch with some of the nurses that I used to work with there, and they said that their program is now full of especially mostly trans, like natal females who are trans identified.
Yeah.
So that's a
Yeah.
huge change. So I think that relationship between eating disorders and trans is a new phenomenon.
Yeah. Yeah. And like the cutting phenomenon in girls, that was primarily a teenage girl thing. Like I think it's just yeah. We're gonna have Lisa Marciano on soon, and we can, yeah, kind of dig
Yeah.
into this phenomena a little bit better.
Well, it's like people that say, you know, trying to compare trans to psychosis, saying, well, this is a delusion that they are the opposite sex. It's like, well, it can look that way from the outside,
Hmm.
but a delusion it's a different. A delusion is just a different condition. It's hard to explain, but a delusion is a different condition with a different pathway and different causes than gender dysphoria. So
Yeah.
it's not really, even though some of us really do have a conviction as a kid, like I really am a boy. It's not the same as a psychotic
Yeah.
delusion, and it wouldn't be treated the same. Like I wouldn't respond if I were to take antipsychotics. It's not going to
Right.
resolve my gender dysphoria.
Yeah. Because it is probably largely hormonally based. I think I'm up.
I don't remember. I've lost track now. Who read?
Now we're now we're really lost.
Did I
All right,
read the
now.
body dysmorphia question?
Yes,
Yeah.
I think you
Okay.
did. Yeah, because I
Okay.
answered first. So in
Your
the
turn.
UK, over the past 6 years, I've heard of many public figures, writers, artists, actors, musicians, comedians, etc., who privately oppose gender identity ideology but won't go public out of fear for their livelihoods. Is there a similar situation in Canada and the USA? Have you had well-known figures privately reaching out to you, and if so, what sort of percentage?
don't think we've had anyone that was really high profile reach out to us. But certainly, in terms of like celebrities, but we definitely do have people reaching out to us, journalists and teachers and counselors and even other trans people saying, I'm concerned, but I'm afraid to go public with this, right? And, afraid for their careers, afraid of losing family, afraid of losing community or friends. So that happens a lot, that a lot of people want to help in some way or do something about this, but they're not at liberty to go public with it.
Yeah, exactly. I'm not aware of personally any celebrities. I'm sure there are, countless numbers of them who are skeptical or concerned and remain silent. I think that's going to start to crack here very soon. I think a few people are going to find their courage, and then it's just going to steamroll from there. But yeah, I'm just like you. I've heard from a lot of people who say, like, I'm a school counselor or I'm a journalist. I'm mostly people who work with teenagers is who I'm hearing from, and saying that, I'm seeing this in my kid's school, or I'm seeing this in the school that I work for, but I can't say anything. Like a friend who works in healthcare, and he's got a lot of colleagues who are basically saying, yes, I'm seeing all this, but I'm not going to say a word about it, And so I think there are a lot of health professionals, a lot of education professionals who see what's happening and they say nothing. And I'm getting angry about it. It's like, just, I don't know.
I understand the fear, but
Yeah.
I think a lot of people, I would say the majority of people out there is my read. I think a lot of people see the problem, are concerned about the problem, but are kind of waiting for the critical mass. They don't want to be one of the leaders, out on a limb getting hacked off. So I think they want a certain amount of safety in numbers before they're willing to come forward. But I think what we're going to see is, as soon as that critical mass happens, it's all of a sudden we're going to be flooded with people speaking out about this. Once people know that they're safe to say something, I think all of a sudden things are going to change very rapidly.
Yeah. If only I just happened sooner.
Yeah. Okay, so somebody was watching episode 34 and had some questions that came out of that episode specifically. So the first question that he asked is, were either or both of us diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and who made that diagnosis? So yeah, you're up to give that one a go.
I was actually diagnosed with transsexualism by an endocrinologist. That was my diagnosis. I didn't have any therapy or any like kind of counseling session or anything like that. So yeah, I was just I told my doctor, my regular just general practitioner, that I had gender dysphoria. I wanted to transition to be a man, and she said, yeah, that sounds like the right thing for you. And here's an endocrinologist who won't require. She's like, I don't think he needs therapy, and because I don't have any like mental health diagnoses or anything. And so she just, I don't think you need therapy. Here's an endocrinologist who will give you testosterone. Without a letter. And then when I went to see him, he was like, I don't know why you were told that. I definitely do require a letter, but let's have a chat. After 15 minutes of just like kind of like my family history and stuff like that, he's like, yep, sounds like you know what you're doing. And yeah, I got my first testosterone injection that day. I got top surgery by a surgeon who didn't require a letter either. So my only diagnosis is transsexualism, which was given to me by the endocrinologist so that he could prescribe testosterone.
I still see a lot of physicians using the transsexualism code for billing, so it's still
okay.
It's still out there.
Wow.
But
that was in 2011.
Okay.
Yeah.
Sometimes the billing codes are different than the diagnostic codes, so maybe that's so they're not necessarily diagnosed with transsexualism, but I'm still seeing that a lot was in patient charts.
Yeah.
But
could be some insurers have an antiquated
could be
coding.
So I was diagnosed with, I think I was diagnosed with gender identity disorder,
Oh yeah.
because it was before gender dysphoria. It was before this current DSM. So it was before it changed from gender identity disorder to gender dysphoria. Vancouver had a specialized gender clinic for a long time. And when I transitioned, it was just after a major uh, overhaul of the system and how transcare was being done in Vancouver. So the original gender health program was dismantled, mostly due to a lot of activist pressure. And then one of the clinics in Vancouver was still known as like the specialized gender clinic, but it had been very much revamped and the processes were all different. So that would have been under the Standards of Care 6. So according to the Standards of Care 6, I mean, that was back in the time where they were still recommending you do the real life experience and then, you know, psychotherapy and a lot of assessment and a very, very slow, careful process. So when I transitioned, it was more of like an intermediate stage. It was the early days of the affirmative model of care. So I was still assessed over a period of several months before I started hormones, but that was done by a family doctor at the specialized clinic. And then before I had any surgeries, I had to see a psychologist and did it was just a single visit, but it was a very detailed psychological assessment. I remember filling out tons of different like screening tools, and you know, I think she screened me for things like personality disorders and mood disorders, and so it was a very thorough evaluation before any surgeries. But it wasn't for the purpose of diagnosis. You know, it wasn't so much for the diagnosing gender identity disorder. It was just assessing all of the other possible mental health
Right,
problems
ruling
that,
things out.
yeah, more of a differential diagnosis. I know it's really different from place to place though, because you know, even within Canada, in Alberta, last I heard, it has to be a psychiatrist that does the hormone readiness assessment, whereas here in BC, any family doctor or nurse practitioner can do it.
Okay. Okay. Yeah, I wonder if the diagnosis is if it ever was for the purpose of diagnosing gender identity disorder or gender dysphoria, but more so basically screening the person for the, you know, whether or not transition was going to be a benefit or a detriment. You know, I think that's probably more what it is than the diagnosis of a condition. You know.
I mean, in the WSPAT standards of care, one of the criteria there's a list of criteria for hormones. One of the criteria is a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, but that's really been minimized in recent years in the informed consent model. If you know,
And
they
I wonder
just
if the W, I don't think the W, it's written in the standards of care, but like a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, what, you know, like does anybody know how to diagnose gender dysphoria other than saying, you know, like did you play with mostly girl toys or boy toys, you know, like that, what is it, 6 or 8, like 8 questions that are very, very superficial and very, um, um, yeah, just, that's like, if that's what it takes to get a diagnosis of gender dysphoria, and if that's what's required for I don't know, it's how the standards of care or whatever, or no, it's the DSM, how the DSM diagnose or says to diagnose gender dysphoria is, um, to be honest, laughable, I'd say. And that's been the guidepost for, I don't know how many years now, long time.
yeah, I kind of think maybe there should be like a fellowship for physicians if they're interested in doing this kind of care, that they receive like specific training for diagnosing it, because that would be the case. Like, I mean, all of the DSM criteria, it is kind of vague. Like even if
Yeah.
even their diagnostic criteria for something like psychosis is kind of
Oh
vague,
yeah.
but
Okay.
psychiatrists learn to do a more thorough and meaningful evaluation when they're doing their training and their residence, and they're doing their residency in psychiatry, is when they're going to get a lot of the more meaningful ways of interviewing people and a more nuanced understanding. So yeah, I think that for someone to just crack open the DSM and look at the list of criteria, it is very vague, and you can see how so many people could potentially fall into that. But
Mhm.
in the descriptive part of that chapter, they do talk about the three different pathways to gender dysphoria. They do talk about the early childhood onset gender dysphoria, which is highly correlated with homosexuality. They do talk about the AGP pathway, and they talk about the DSD pathway. So they talk about three different pathways to gender dysphoria in the DSM. But that's, unfortunately, that information is really divorced from and missing from the WPATH standards of care.
Yeah. Is the next one, is that a separate question, would you say?
It's kind of related. It's the same person asking, so I'll just read this one as well. So it's about the butch femme subculture that we've talked about in previous episodes, and they said, do you not see this as a time in space when lesbians and gay people were more underground or hidden? It was a thing. So meaning like the butch femme subculture was a thing. But now with the level of acceptance and no need to be in dark clubs, is there less of a community and more people just living their lives? And with times changing, so does the look of a group of people.
I think you're probably more qualified to answer this question because you were in the butch femme scene back in the day. But my answer to this is no. I don't think that would be an explanation for the change, because again, like we were talking about earlier, is I think we both agree that there's likely more than one pathway to female homosexuality, and I think the reason the butch femme, I think it's an organic thing. I think it's, again, going back to gender does have a use in society, and I think that's what we're seeing play out here. Is like I don't think it's like, I guess some critics would say like or like trying to be heteronormative and that's problematic. I think it's just it's an organic result of somebody who's naturally quite masculine, and then somebody who's kind of just typically feminine, but just happens to be same-sex attracted. But yeah, I think it's an organic whatever, I don't know what word to describe that, but and so no, I don't think it has to do with acceptance or lack thereof, or even why lack thereof would need to create that like lack of acceptance, like homophobia would need to create that, accepting that whole heteronormative imitation thing. But anyway, I'll stop and let you go now.
Well, it's a point of criticism that I have, or a point of conflict that I've had with corners of radical feminism for years, because I think the radical feminist take on the butch femme subculture was that it was very performative, that it was just shame in our drive to be more heteronormative, that we kind of mocked heterosexual couples by one person being the man and one person being the woman. And so there was that criticism,
a bit of a charade or something.
Yeah, that it was just that it was just superficially a subculture and a choice that we made to perform these gender roles to mimic heterosexual couples. And I think the read of that was wrong. I mean, to put it bluntly, I don't think it was that superficial. I think what they missed in their understanding of it, I think butch lesbians are a type of lesbian. I think that is their authentic, that was our authentic experience of how we expressed ourselves and our gender nonconformity related to our sexual orientation. I don't think it was just a costume that we were putting on to play, the male role. I think that's too shallow and superficial a read to it. I think there are aspects like the subcultural aspects of the butch femme scene. Some of that was performative and a cultural thing. So the fact that butch femme culture was kind of modeled after 1950s dating rituals, and I've talked about that in the past before too. And I don't think that doesn't have to be a part of it. I think that part can evolve. Like there's no reason for why we have to be stuck in the 1950s when every other relationship has moved on, right? I mean, that I think is personal choice, how we want to interact with our partners and model our relationships. But the butch part, I think, is something that just came naturally to us, and we can't control our attractions either. I mean, I can't force myself to be attracted to butches or men or anyone that I'm not attracted to. I'm just attracted to who I'm attracted to, and I'm attracted to feminine women. So I think you're right that there was a butch femme dynamic that I think just came organically. And I think we've really seen a lot as the narrative has changed it, and we've shifted more to trans. I think a lot of young kids who would probably grow up to butch lesbians are interpreting their experience as I am trans, and
Mhm.
that's what our
Oh,
whole
yeah.
culture and our society is telling them.
Yeah. Yep. And the boys too, but at a younger age, I think.
Yeah.
All right. Time for one more, then wrap it up.
Yep.
So I live in a progressive town. My kids are asked what their pronouns are at school, camp, etc. My 8-year-old is so confused. He recently told someone his pronouns were she, he, they. How do I discuss this with them and not put them in a position to be alienated with peers?
Yeah, it's a tough one. I mean, one thought I have is, if you draw a parallel to other belief systems, like our kids go to public schools with other kids who have probably their families have a lot of different belief systems, right? There might be different faith beliefs, so they're among their peer group. They may have friends that are Christians or Muslims or a lot of different belief systems. So, I mean, could we think of gender ideology as another belief system that we don't have to believe the same things in order to be friends with somebody or to accept somebody else's beliefs?
Yeah, yeah, I agree. But I mean, in this situation too, it's kind of it's being institutionally imposed. So I like your yeah, your belief system. That's exactly what it is. I think we could look at it almost like if a Muslim kid was for whatever reason was going to a Catholic school, right, or an atheist kid was going to a Catholic school or a Muslim school or whatever the case may be. It's kind of like this is what they believe. This is not what we believe at home or what you necessarily have to believe, but this is um, it's hard because it is we're talking about public schools which are but yeah, I think that's the only way to kind of frame this is it's a belief system. And um maybe yeah, for the sake of fitting in and not alienating yourself or being disrespectful or whatever, there could be some benefit to going along with the pronoun thing or whatever, because that's the custom.
Mhm.
um I don't think that's going to be the custom much longer, but it's certainly not. It shouldn't be on a child's shoulders to buck the system and alienate themselves. Like, let us do that, and like
Yeah.
the kids can go along with the pronoun thing. Um,
And a lot
uh,
of kids, I mean, I've got school age kids, and a lot of kids we sometimes underestimate a kid's ability to think critically. And I know
mhm,
I've heard some parents say, like, yeah, my kid learned about that stuff in school and they think it's stupid. Like
mhm,
kids are starting to push back on this stuff.
yeah, yeah,
And I know one of my kids came home from school saying that their teacher taught them all about the 7 8 genders. I don't remember what the number was, but taught them all of that, some of that gender ideology stuff. And she found some of the teaching about intersex interesting, but as far as the gender stuff, I mean, with my kids, it kind of went in one ear and out the other. They think it's stupid. So
right,
they're not, just because it's taught in schools. I do want to kind of reassure parents a little bit. I mean, just
yeah,
because it's taught in schools doesn't necessarily mean that the kids have to believe it and get behind it.
right, yep, very good point.
Could we do one? Was one
Oh yeah,
that question that came to me today. Just I thought
oh
it was
yeah,
such a great question about AGP and why it seems to be kind of culture bound to North
yes,
America and
yes.
Europe, and why isn't it happening outside in other places? I thought that was a really interesting question.
It is a very very good question, and my answer to that is it is happening. I think AGP is culturally neutral and universal and probably throughout time. As long as there's been male sexuality and people with weird crossed wires in their head, not to be again like just put it like glibly. Um, but I think it's just we happen to live in a moment of time where we have culturally and ideologically decided that that means that they're women, whereas in other cultures throughout all time, and well, maybe not all. I know obviously there's a Roman emperor who certainly got away with it, and I think as we've discussed, certainly some musicians who are able to get away with it in certain cultures, and but it all has to be done. It all has to be done within the terms of that culture, within the language and the understanding of that culture. And there are, I mean, there are we when we had Rod Fleming on, he was talking about how there are certainly AGP transsexuals in Southeast Asia. They don't have that understanding of it as AGP, but it's clearly that's what it is. And so if you have a culture where transsexuality is accepted in some regard, you're going to have both motivators for it, And but I think just in the vast majority of cultures, nobody's going to give up being a heterosexual man to be probably publicly reviled and possibly harmed. So I think it's just we're seeing so much of it now because our culture is celebrating it.
Yeah, in the cultures we've talked a little bit about those countries where they have like a third gender, like the fa'afafine, and that just because gender nonconformity has a place in their society doesn't mean it's a very elevated place in society. It doesn't mean they don't experience any homophobia or discrimination. And I mean, what Rod was describing to us is that they're kind of segregated to certain occupations and certain stations in life when they're assigned as a fa'afafine, which doesn't mean they can't be happy and live fulfilling lives. But I don't want to paint these cultures as total utopias where life is totally grand for them. But it would be such a different pathway, because the fa'afafine, and I want to stress, like outside of the West, homosexual gender nonconformity is kind of the norm, more so than in the East, more so than in the West. And that used to be the case even here in the West prior to the 80s. I think I have sort of a hypothesis in my head that AIDS did a lot to start cracking down on gender nonconformity amongst homosexuals. But so outside of the West, the fa'afafine to us kind of sounds, sort of unusual and foreign to us, but because they don't necessarily have a third gender category in all of the Eastern countries, but especially male homosexuality does tend to be a lot more, they do present a lot more feminine outside of the West than here. So with the fa'afafine or the ladyboys, they would have been identified as fa'afafine at an early age because they were obviously gender nonconforming, and no one was telling them to be. It was just organically, people were observing that these boys were behaving in a very effeminate manner, and so they were told, well, this probably means you're one of these fa'afafine. That wouldn't be the pathway for those with AGP. Like, they would have been fairly typical boys up until a certain age. And it would be later in life that they maybe would feel motivated to live as girls, but it would have been obvious to everyone in those villages, like, well, but you weren't one of these fa'afafine up until age 19 or whatever. It would have been a very awkward transition into being a ladyboy, I would think.
Yeah. I wonder, would it be culturally allowed, and would there be an internal motivator to do that? I just don't think there would be.
I don't see where
in the Samoan country, in the Samoan culture, in Filipino culture, there is a you can see why that would be appealing to an AGP, but in Samoa, especially where they don't have like medical interventions, right? So I don't see. It's so. I think it's also culture bound. I think in ours right now, like I think one of the primary reasons we see so many heterosexual males transitioning, and what is probably most likely autogynophilia, but I think there are other motivators, is our culture right now vilifies heterosexual males, right? Especially, I think there's just so many push and pull factors to the AGP or just heterosexual male transition here in the West right now. But I think a lot of it is probably culturally created. I mean, there's certainly merit to the porn hypothesis. I think that does play a big role. But I think. What would AGP look like? I mean, we kind of know what it would look like in Thailand and these kind of more industrial Southeast. I don't know what it looks like in like China or Japan, but
Rod was describing a real kind of class division too, that the lady boys tend to be of the lower classes, because as you climb the social ladder, gender nonconformity is less and less accepted. So you can't be and I made a tweet kind of to this effect. It's hard to wrap nuance into a tweet, but this is what I was getting at, was that gender nonconformity. I mean, you couldn't be a doctor or a lawyer as a ladyboy, is what he was describing. That it tended to be the lower classes that were allowed this flexibility to be a third gender, but not so much in the upper classes. So I would think that if an adult male with AGP wanted to transition, it would probably, depending on what social class he was in too, it wouldn't just be a change from male to ladyboy. It could potentially be a fall from their social class as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it's going to be, and it's also, I don't think even so much of a calculated decision. It's like it also has to do with like their upbringing, their parenting. It's like, so like, again, Rod Fleming was saying that when it's an upper class family, any gender nonconformity in a young age is kind of like beaten out. It's like it's just not tolerated, and so you're going to repress and internalize and repress, I imagine.
Mm-hmm.
And that's going to be the case of whatever your reason to whatever your desire to live as a woman, wherever that desire is coming from. It's going to have so much negative external consequences, most of which you probably already internalized,
Mm-hmm.
that it's not even a question of what occupation is available for me after this. It's probably just a lot of it's already been kind of beaten out of your consciousness.
Which is what happens more here in the West. That was just that we're not a culture that tolerates gender nonconformity very well. We think of ourselves as all these other we think of ourselves as so progressive, and all these other countries as so archaic and homophobic, but we're the culture that created trans. I think of queer theory because in the early desistance literature, they said that low social status was one of the reasons for why gender dysphoria doesn't resolve in adolescence. That was sort of one of the observations, but was that it tends to persist more in lower social classes. But I kind of think some of that class dynamics might have been happening. It's potentially a wrong read of why that's the case. It might be similar to what was happening in Samoa, that we see that there's more, perhaps more acceptance of gender nonconformity in the lower classes, where it's getting beaten out of people more in the upper classes. And so maybe there's just more people wanting to transition in the lower classes. Like I know for me, growing up in a farming family, it wasn't uncommon for farming women to look like butch lesbians.
Right.
Even though they were
going to be farming in the high heels.
So there is I definitely saw some gender nonconformity. I think of queer theory as being the middle class solution to gender nonconformity in higher classes. The higher classes won't tolerate it. The lower classes can't afford to tolerate it. So Well, good stuff. There's a couple of questions we didn't get to. Apologize if those were any of your questions, but just for time, we should probably wrap up.
Yep. And thanks for sending them in. They were excellent.
Excellent questions. Gets me thinking about things too.
Yeah.
I enjoyed.
Had a lot of original thoughts along the way. I did. Yeah.
All right. Well, thanks very much. See you next time.
Yeah.
Thanks for joining us for this episode of the Transparency Podcast. If you enjoy our content, please help out our algorithm by hitting like or subscribe. If you'd like to make a donation, follow the link to our PayPal account. On behalf of the Gender Dysphoria Alliance, thanks for your support.